So in this video, we're going to do another example with exceptions in Java, and we'll add a few things we didn't see before, including how to throw an exception. So suppose I want to write a method, and we're going to call this check number. I need to put that actually in my class. There we go. And I'm going to print a message when I start. And I'll print another one when I end. And then I'll call this method here. And I'll pass it a parameter of 10. So if I run this, okay, it doesn't really do anything interesting yet. However, let's suppose that I want to only accept numbers that are positive. Now, there's better ways to handle this. As an example of what we can do with exceptions, I can throw an illegal argument exception if that number is less than 0. So this is going to be my function. And this function, again, if something happens, I'll throw an exception. And typically, again, you might want to report an error status or something like that, but doing exceptions to handle error cases isn't ideal, but this is just, again, to show you how this works. So I'm going to do check number 10, and then I'll do check number minus 10. And let's print what the number is. And when we run this, you can see it runs okay with 10, but with negative 10, it starts, but then it throws an exception. Okay, so we know what to do if we want to handle exception. We're going to catch it. However, let's do this. In this example, let's write another function. We'll call it doExample. And this will also take a number. And let's do our start and end. Let's take off a tab at the beginning. And let's call check number on the number that gets passed in. So this obviously can create an exception. So we're going to surround it in a try block. And we're going to catch an illegal argument exception. And if that happens, we'll print out to error, and we'll say exception in doExample. Okay. And then we'll have a finally block. So no matter what happens here, we'll say finally doExample. All right, so let's run this. And let's call doExample instead of check number. So we start doExample, it calls check number, very good. And then we have D and D, so let's do an E there. Let's put an empty line there as well. So let's run this again. Okay, so here's the first one where we call doExample. You see it calls doExample, which calls check number. DoExample calls check number, but then notice this finally still gets called. So that's the doExample finally. And then we also, you'll see that this is in red, but that's coming from this statement right here. Again, when we print a system error, it'll show up in red, and it might or might not show up in the right place in the output, because again, those are two separate streams. Okay, so I think that should give you an example of how some of this works. One other thing I want to show you though, what if we put a return, not here, that'll just return. What if we put a return here? What's going to happen? Well, if I run this, even though there's a return after this illegal argument exception, notice it still does the finally block for do example. But notice it doesn't print end do example. So even though the function does return, the finally block gets executed before the return actually happens. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that finally block is going to execute in essentially every case. There's some really catastrophic errors that can occur to prevent that from happening, but for the most part, that finally block is going to run. Okay, so here's another example of exceptions, also exception propagation, because you can see that got passed up. We see throwing an exception. So there's some good examples in here, and we'll be using exceptions a lot later in the semester. In fact, when we get to our container data structures, we'll actually start developing our own exceptions.